I'm so often asked about alcohol and how it can be part of a healthy lifestyle. Is it something that I'm going to tell my clients to give up completely? And my answer is so often that it's a very individual thing, and you've got to do what's going to work best for you. And, some people will struggle to hit their goals whilst alcohol is part of their lifestyle, whereas others can incorporate it and still work towards their goals. In this conversation today, we're going to be getting much, much more into it. I've got Dr. Brooke Scheller on the podcast, and she is someone who has written an incredible book. It's called How to Eat to Change How You Drink. We're going to talk about the book a lot, but this podcast is going to be for anyone who is interested in the impact of alcohol on your system and whether it's going to be beneficial for you to drink less. So whether you only drink a little bit or you only drink occasionally when you're out socially, or whether you are concerned that you might have a little bit of a problem with alcohol, you're going to find this podcast interesting. If you drink alcohol, you're going to find it helpful, because we're going to be going much further than just talking about the obvious stuff that we know about alcohol. We're going to be digging into how it impacts our biochemistry and our hormones and our metabolism, how it behaves in your body, and also how the way that you drink can be linked to your biochemistry as well. It's an absolutely fascinating conversation, and I know that you're going to find it really, really helpful. Welcome to the Thriving Metabolism. My name's Louise Digby. I'm a registered nutritional therapist and founder of the Nourish Method to Lasting Fat Loss. It's my mission to empower you so that you and your metabolism thrives and you never have to go through diet misery again. Let's dive in. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining me. Perhaps you could start off by introducing yourself, telling us a little bit about who you are and what you do and why you wrote your book.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be having this conversation with you. And I am a doctor of nutrition by trade, and I'm trained in functional medicine and looking at gut health, hormones, and nutrient deficiencies, the works. And I'm classically trained kind of as a generalist. And much of my background was working with folks with a variety of different conditions, whether that be GI conditions or autoimmune diseases, hormone imbalances. And I spent part of my career in clinical practice and kind of the second part of it working in startup organizations. So, a little bit of diversity in my background, but really how I started doing this work is because I went through my own journey of getting sober. And I tell all about this in the book. But I really recognized through my experience as a doctor of nutrition who struggled with alcohol in the end, how much this is plaguing our society and how so many people who aren't at that point where they need, quote unquote, to quit, but alcohol is still having an impact on their health. It's still affecting systems like the gut, like our hormones, like our metabolism, right? And so many people are struggling, right? I looked back at my experience in working in clinical practice, and a lot of people would be willing to take supplements, they'd be willing to do infrared saunas and all of these different things, but they wouldn't be willing necessarily to change their alcohol intake. And so it really has become my mission to help educate people on really what it's doing to the body, because as you mentioned, there's not enough information about it. And when we think about it from this perspective of health and wellness, I really believe it changes the reason why we might choose to make a change in our alcohol behaviors.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the book you talk about things like our biochemistry and how our own biochemistry can impact the choices that we make and all that sort of thing. And I think one of the reasons why I found the book so refreshing is because many years ago when I was studying, I think back in probably about 2010, I read a really great book called Potatoes, Not Prozac. I don't know if you've come across it. And it's a book that talks about food and mental health, and it touches on addictions as well. And, it's a really fascinating perspective. But I would say since then, I've not heard anyone talk about the impact of how what we eat can, help us with regulating alcohol intake or overcoming addictions or that sort of thing. So that's part of the reason why I found it such a good read. But I want our listeners to kind of understand, based on their goals, why they should care about
Yeah.
their alcohol intake if they don't actually have a problem with alcohol. And so our listeners are generally women who are struggling with weight loss and very often doing all the things, they're working out lots, trying to eat clean, but wanting to dig deeper and understand, their hormones, their metabolism. So, how does alcohol come into this? How does that impact these systems? It's a big question.
Yeah. Well, I want to touch on what you said a little bit, which is there isn't enough information out there about the impacts of food and how we eat on mental health in general, right? There has been a variety of books that have come out over the last few years and more people kind of moving into the space and talking about it. But exactly to that point of potatoes over Prozac, that book, right? We are completely overlooking this as part of why we experience mood and mental health imbalances, addiction kind of, falling under that category. But what is the reason why a lot of people choose to drink? Well, they choose to drink if they're anxious, if they have low mood, if they're stressed, right? All of these things that are part of the mental health category. So regardless of if you identify of having a quote unquote problem with alcohol or not, is, aside from the point, right? Because many people, and part of the reason why in chapter 3 of the book, I talk about these drinking archetypes is because in my story, I was drinking a lot by the time that I quit drinking. But when I started doing this work with other people, sure, there were some people that were interested that drank like me and really needed help and support to stop. They were drinking more like daily or almost daily. But I also had a lot of people that would come to me that drank on the weekends or only a couple times a month, but they felt like when they started, they couldn't stop. And they felt like, they tried to say, oh, I'm not going to drink this week. And by Tuesday, they're having something to drink, right? And so it's really this insidious thing because alcohol is, first of all, it's really, really immersed in our society, in our cultures. And so it is involved in everything we do, whether that is family, friends, work, celebrations, grief. So it's really made its way into all these different avenues. And for a lot of people, they've never, they struggle with how do I have fun without alcohol? How would I go to a wedding and not imbibe? And so I really think it's a interesting way to challenge yourself on this topic of like, how much is this really affecting me? But to kind of answer the second part of your question, which is a big question, and I think we could break into, some different parts here, is that a lot of people think that, and to kind of just tie it into the weight specific or metabolism specific topic, there's this misnomer that if you are having a lower carb or a lower sugar alcohol, that maybe it's better for you, it's not having as much of an impact. But the ethanol molecule, which is the part that makes us tipsy and drunk, is part of what makes alcohol so harmful to the body, right? So sure, if we're having, a sugary drink and that's going to introduce sugar, that's a problem. But the ethanol molecule itself is what actually affects our hormones. It drives cortisol, right? So it increases our stress hormones. And a question I get a lot is, well, stress is bad for us, right? And so this is a good thing because it's helping me reduce my stress. But it's really a misunderstanding because it's actually making stress worse, right? And in addition to the cortisol effects there, it's impacting how we regulate blood sugar. It's impacting our sex hormone production. So estrogen, testosterone, progesterone. So it is having an impact on all of these different hormones, including metabolism regulating hormones. So I share this not to tell everybody that they need to stop drinking entirely, but if you are struggling to manage weight, and you're drinking alcohol on a somewhat regular basis, this actually may be part of what is holding you back because it is not allowing your hormones to function properly.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that you also explain in the book, which I'm gonna repeat, but not do it in such a um, articulate way, is about how essentially when we have alcohol in our system, it's virtually impossible for us to get into fat burning, right?
It is because it's basically training our body into this place. We're utilizing alcohol as an energy source, right? Because one thing that I learned early in nutrition training is that alcohol is technically a macronutrient, right? It incorporates calories into our diet. So calories are coming from the alcohol itself, not just whatever it's mixed with, right? But it is going to affect how we regulate blood sugar, how we are burning fat, because we are not necessarily getting into a state where our body is able to work and function adequately, right? The alcohol puts a really big stress on our liver. And so, unfortunately, that usually tends to become the priority process of the liver. It kind of puts everything else in the back burner: fat burning, hormone balance and metabolism, waste removal of toxins, absorption of nutrients, and things along those lines.
That's such a good reminder because I think for a lot of people, we probably feel that the liver is there to help us get rid of the alcohol and maybe process drugs and that sort of thing. And it probably doesn't
Mm.
do a whole lot else. But we forget that it is involved in so many things in the body, from hormone regulation to digestion and
Mhm.
inflammation and blood sugars and so many different things. And so putting alcohol into our system is going to have an impact on all of those systems in the body. So
Yeah.
it's
And I'm glad you brought that up too, because it is kind of, everyone thinks, well, the liver is just kind of it's this sponge, right? That's its job, is to remove toxins. But it also is involved in, like you said, hormone balance, right? Part of the reason why alcohol increases the risk for breast cancer is because of the way it affects the liver's metabolism of excess estrogen. Right. And
mm,
so what happens is we end up with a buildup of estrogen dominance, and that can not only contribute to increased risk for cancer, which is quite significant for even just a couple of drinks per week for women. It's quite significant increase, but also can create other estrogen dominant types of symptoms, right? So that might be PMS symptoms, that might be heavy periods, that might be more intense menopause symptoms, that might be difficulty with weight loss, right? And so all of these things are really important to consider when we think about the health of the body as a whole, but how the liver does play a role in these other pieces as well.
so with there's kind of been this misnomer that a little bit of alcohol is
Mhm.
potentially even beneficial for our health,
Mhm.
and you obviously speak to that in the book. And
Mhm.
it would be great to hear about what the current thinking is on that, and what the research actually tells us about how much alcohol is healthy and safe.
Yeah, so there were some studies that were done in the early 90s, late 90s, early 2000s, kind of in that 10 or 12-year time frame, that were showing these potential benefits of alcohol for cardiovascular health. And some of that was looking at how alcohol actually dilates the blood vessels, so it kind of increases blood flow, where there was a thought that is this potentially good for, cardiovascular system. There's this really early study on something called the French paradox, which is that the French have a very low incidence of cardiovascular disease, even though they consume high amounts of saturated fats and wine, which is very drastically different from what we've looked at in terms of nutrition recommendations, right? And that almost leads into some of the discussion around, I get asked a lot about the blue zones, right? Well, there are these regions of the world where, people live a really long time and they have some wine. But there's a lot of other factors there, especially with the blue zones, right? These are people who are walking every day. These are people who are living on really, really low processed food diet, really rich in fresh produce, healthy fats, fish. They are in community, right? So they are connected with others. So in that instance of, some wine here and there isn't necessarily a problem. But in a lot of the modern world, what's happening is we're not drinking wine like that. We're having maybe too much of it. We're pairing it with fried foods and processed foods. And it isn't necessarily like alongside this kind of pristine diet and lifestyle. But a lot of the research has changed over the last even 5 years, that is really showing that some of that early research isn't necessarily may be correct, that we've seen in the last, in 2022, actually, there were a couple of really big studies on this, and one that looked at cardiovascular risk with alcohol consumption in about 300,000 participants. And what the outcome of that study was that no amount of alcohol provides benefit for cardiovascular health. And so we're really seeing a lot of that kind of debunked in recent times. And so even in a couple of years ago, the World Health Organization put out a statement that said no amount of alcohol is safe. And I'll explain it in this way, that there's speculation that because there's resveratrol, an antioxidant in wine, that maybe that contributes some benefit. But I like to share this with people because I think it changes your perspective on it, in that alcohol is, for lack of a better word, it's a poison, right? The reason why we feel drunk when we drink it is because it's poisoning our nervous system, right? It's causing us to not be able to walk in a straight line, to not be able to drive in a straight line. And when we think about it in that way, we have to recognize then that if it is a poison, like, do poisons have benefits in small amounts? Well, not necessarily, right? So again, I don't say this to scare you and to use fear tactics, but to really help you understand more about the science of what's happening when we consume it.
It's such an interesting perspective. And I think it's so helpful to understand the science and understand what's
Mhm.
actually happening in your body, deeper than just it's bad for you, or a little
Right.
bit of it is good for you, even though that's now been debunked. So, in your book, you talk a bit about these archetypes of, different kind of types of drinkers. And you also talk about how your biochemistry impacts how alcohol impacts you and how you kind of make choices around alcohol. So tell us a little bit about that, because one of the things that I found super interesting was to do with how cravings for alcohol may
Mhm.
actually be something else entirely.
Yeah, well, let me touch on the archetypes there first. Part of the inspiration behind the archetypes was this experience that I had in working with others, where, when I first started doing this work and trying to help people to quit drinking or cut back their alcohol intake from this nutrition perspective, I expected to be working with more people who drank like I did, like who were that daily or almost daily drinker, who were kind of on the heavier side of their alcohol use. But as I mentioned, I had some people coming to me who were only drinking on the weekends or a couple of times a month, and they still felt like they needed some help and support with control and managing this. And so even though they weren't a daily drinker, they were still saying, for some reason, I can't seem to say no to this. I can't seem to just moderate after one. And that is because alcohol is an addictive substance. And the way that it affects us when we have one is it creates this kind of drive or desire for another one, right? So not a lot of people are really in that camp where they can really truly just have one or have a half a glass. But I did create an archetype for this, kind of like the fourth archetype, which we call the nonchalant drinker, which is someone who really can truly take it or leave it. And a lot of this conversation isn't necessarily relevant to that type of person, right? Because they're probably not drinking enough that it's affecting their body or their biochemistry. But there are three main drinking archetypes. The first is the social drinker. So this is someone who is drinking mostly in social situations. It is maybe more of that weekend drinking, that, only special occasion type of drinking, but still feeling like once they start, they can't stop. The next is the stress drinker. And this is someone who is drinking mostly for stress reasons. It's at the end of the workday. It's being triggered by some type of stressful situation. This especially too, there's really interesting research around cortisol. And, we kind of touched on this in the beginning, the way that alcohol kind of increases cortisol levels. But actually, if we have an instance of binge drinking, so 4 or more drinks in a sitting, they can actually predict future binge drinking behavior based off of previous binge drinking. And it actually has to do with cortisol, right? Because what's happening is we are spiking our cortisol and we are looking for something to kind of help create that stress relief, that kind of immediate stress relief. So the stress drinker, again, is someone who's maybe drinking a little bit more than that social drinker. But our third drinking archetype, kind of the one that I most identified with, is this habitual drinker. And this is someone who is drinking more like that daily or almost daily, and is really feeling that there's no specific trigger. It is everything. It is just basically getting through the day is a trigger for that type of person. And so with that being said, there's kind of these different pieces behind each of these archetypes of what is maybe driving that decision to drink, what is kind of also going on physiologically for that person, because someone who's drinking more like daily probably has more physiological impacts from alcohol consumption, maybe than someone who's drinking a few times a week might experience.
Yeah, absolutely. You answered that question so well because I realized it was such a big and almost like muddled question. So thank you for going through those archetypes. I think it's really helpful to be able to identify with one of those archetypes to help you to see what the steps forward are. I know for
Yeah.
me, I fall into the social drinking category.
Mhm.
And, you know, I before reading your book, I didn't really feel like I needed to worry about it. You know, I needed to cut down
Mhm.
at all. But now reading it, I now have the desire to cut down and drink less because you know, there's no benefits at
Mhm.
all. And, you know, it's about your overall well-being. And I think that's what the book has shown me is that it is impacting my overall well-being.
Yeah. 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 And I think from a social drinker perspective, there's probably a lot of people listening who fall into that camp. It's quite a common one. But I would say that, it is helpful to explore, what does socializing without alcohol look like, right? Because for so many people, they've always done that, right? It's always been part of their nature. They never really have thought twice about it. And it may be good to try taking a 30-day break or challenging yourself in some of these social situations to say no to a drink and see how that experience fares for you, right? Because there's a lot of fear behind what happens if you tell people that you're not going to drink, and are people going to ask questions? Are they going to judge you? Are they going to think that you have a problem, right? And I always tell people that we're in an era right now where there's huge trends towards sober curious and non-alcoholic beverages and all of that, that the statistic in the US is that 41% of people are trying to quit or cut back in their alcohol consumption, which is
Wow.
almost half, right? Significant. And so if you tell someone that you're taking a break or that you're not drinking tonight because you're cutting back, there's a really good chance that they're going to say, I've been thinking about doing that too. How's it going? Right. And instead of this, like, oh, come on, have a drink, right? Which I think 5 or 10 years ago was what was happening. Now people are interested. They want to know more. There's not so much of a stigma around it, and it's
Mhm.
really, really widely accepted now in a way that it wasn't before. So I really challenge everyone to try it and see, because I think you might be surprised with how much you enjoy socializing without alcohol, especially if you've never tried it before.
I love
Mhm,
that. It's very encouraging because
mhm,
you know, you can kind of look at it from the perspective of if you share that you're trying to cut back on alcohol, then you might inspire someone else to do the same, and that's going to have a positive impact on their life. So even more reason to cut back. So it'd be
mhm,
great to get into some practical strategies for cutting back on alcohol
mhm,
because, you know, as we've mentioned, you look at it, you know, much deeper than just using willpower to have less
mhm,
alcohol. So what's kind of like the best place to start when you're trying
mhm.
to reduce your alcohol intake?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, getting integrated into more of these kinds of discussions around alcohol reduction, I think is a really helpful tool. There are tons of podcasts and books, aside from mine, that are talking about this concept of sober curiosity or, alcohol reduction, the benefits of alcohol elimination, or even kind of quote unquote mindful drinking is another term that's being used. And so, first and foremost, aside from this conversation, dig in a little bit more into these discussions and hear people's experiences and stories, because I think it's really helpful on this journey to hear what other people have experienced and get more kind of tips and tricks and insights, because it will kind of inspire you, like just like you said, Louise, like there is this inspirational aspect of it, of like, I can tell you with utmost certainty that my life transformed in all of the best ways when I eliminated alcohol. And I don't say that to like yank your chain. I say that because it's true in my experience. And I wouldn't have written a book without it, to be honest.
Mm.
I definitely wouldn't have written a book on sobriety. I didn't think that that one was coming. But there's definitely some physiological things to consider, not only for, these maybe people who are drinking a little bit more often, but can also work in the social kind of drinking scheme too. And the book gets into a lot of these kinds of tips and strategies. But one thing that I talk a lot about is overcoming that craving, right? A lot of times we feel that, like, especially at the end of like a long day or a long week, and we kind of get that like, "Ugh, like I need a drink" kind of feeling and sensation. And a lot of times in my experience in working with clients is that this is actually the result of low blood sugar. And especially if you get triggered in that 4 or 5 o'clock time frame, my first question to people is always, well, when was the last time you had something to eat? Right? Usually it's lunch 4 or 5 hours before, and they've gone far too long without having something to eat, or maybe they had a high sugar afternoon snack, right? And simply by having something to eat prior to just grabbing a drink can really, really take a craving away. And so that is something that I work on people a lot with, just making sure they're getting something to eat every 3 to 4 hours, that they're increasing their protein intake throughout the day, because that's going to help stabilize that blood sugar and make it so that we aren't so reliant on willpower, as you were talking about.
Mm.
So I like that tip, especially if you're someone who experiences that like end of the day intense craving. I do also talk a lot in the book about using supplements and how supplements can be a great strategy for overcoming this as well. And there's a few, I use some amino acid supplements like L-glutamine and L-theanine, and these are really great also for cravings. But L-theanine in particular, I use a lot with clients who have more of that anxiety-driven craving to drink. So it's that too wound up, high stress, kind of ruminating brain that makes us want to numb and check out, that using something like L-theanine can be a really great tool. And it works pretty quickly, right? You can take it, and within a couple of minutes, people usually experience some relief from that.
Mm.
So I'm a huge proponent of incorporating in some of these other adjuncts too, that again, remove that need for willpower, right? Especially in the beginning of this process, it can usually be tricky. It can feel really uncomfortable. And I really challenge people to try to get to the root of what's driving that, right? Like, what is driving that craving? Usually, if we have an intense desire for something, you know this, Louise, it's something our body is trying to tell us something,
Mm.
right? So we either need to eat, we need to sleep, we need to take some deep breaths, we need to get outside for a few minutes, we need to call a friend. And so a lot of this practice is just tuning back in to what our body is trying to tell us, rather than like first gut reaction to numb it out or to, quiet it down.
It so often comes back to getting in touch with your body and what it's trying to tell you. And
Mhm,
our bodies are so good at telling us what it needs. And the thing that
mhm,
it doesn't need is
mhm.
alcohol, because it doesn't
Yeah.
do anything for us. So we've got to try and reinterpret those cravings and figure out, is it stress? Is it that your
Mhm,
blood sugars are dropping? Have
mhm,
you had enough sleep? and all these things go
Mhm.
back to those basics and getting the foundations in place, which is something we talk about all the time on this podcast. So,
Totally.
hopefully something that listeners feel quite familiar with in terms of what those foundations are. So, before we wrap up, is there anything that you feel like we've missed in this conversation? Obviously, there's so much more in your book, and I encourage listeners
Mhm.
to read your book. But is there
Yeah.
anything big that you feel like we've missed from this conversation at all?
Yeah, two little things that I want to just kind of call attention to that I talk about in the book. One is the impacts of alcohol on the gut microbiome.
Mm,
I'm sure you've covered this topic in extension in this podcast because the gut microbiome is not only key for hormone balance and metabolism and all of those things, but really for overall health, for reducing autoimmunity, for improving immune system function, skin health. I mean, you name it, we know that the gut is involved. And there is a pretty big impact of alcohol on the gut microbiome and having a healthy gut microbiome. So I have people who take probiotics for years and have no improvement. And sure enough, they've been consuming alcohol a few times per week. And that's kind of setting them back a little bit further. And I'll give the example. This is, I think a lot of people can relate to this, but hand sanitizer, right? We use hand sanitizer to kill bacteria on our hands, right? Well, hand sanitizer is made of alcohol, right? Alcohol is what is killing the bacteria on our hands. If we are drinking alcohol, it is having that same effect on the bacteria in our stomach, right? So it's typically creating some level of dysbiosis. It's potentially lowering levels of our probiotics, even if we're taking them, right? So that's another big piece that I like to mention to people, especially if there are gut health issues that you're trying to manage or you've been kind of trying for many years to get your gut under control. The other thing too is something I really like to talk about are the impact of nutrient deficiencies. And one of the other really well-known, well-studied effects of alcohol use is nutrient depletion
mm,
in everything from our B vitamins, including things like B6 and B12 and folate, which are really critical for mood. And unfortunately, it's kind of like a vicious cycle, right? Especially if we are experiencing anxiety, depression, or other types of mood imbalances. This is really making things worse again and not better. So replenishing these nutrients as part of this process is really critical for improving mood, improving energy. And I have people sometimes that cut back or eliminate alcohol and they still don't really feel great. And the first thing I tell them is that they have to replenish their body, right? Especially if consumption is a little bit higher, it's, at least a couple of times per week that there are going to be effects. Not just the B vitamins, though, things like our vitamin D and our magnesium, which is our body's relaxing mineral, right?
mm.
70% of the population is deficient in magnesium. And so if we are deficient in magnesium, we have trouble relaxing. Well, what do people use alcohol for? They use it for relaxation, right? So by utilizing some of these other nutritional tools, and this is again where not only foods become important, but supplements too. And I talk about all of these in the book, but really strategizing to repair these systems of the body so that you aren't just like white knuckling it, trying to get through the evening or the afternoon without taking a drink, saying, what is it that my body needs? Is it relaxation? Can I bring in some of these other things that can help me experience that same thing without the harmful effects of alcohol?
Yeah, it sounds like it's all about setting yourself up for success. And if you get those foundations in place and you make sure that you're replenishing these nutrients and getting your protein in to balance your blood sugars and taking steps to manage stress, it's going to be an easier path to reducing the alcohol intake because the cravings are going to reduce, and you're not, like you say,
Mhm,
going to have to be using willpower just to resist the cravings and get through. So
mhm.
that's super super helpful. And I love your example of the hand sanitizer, because we just inherently know that it would be bad for us to drink hand sanitizer. It kills
Yeah.
bacteria. We don't want that. And yet alcohol does exactly the same thing. It is the same thing.
It's the
But
same thing
really,
with a prettier label, right? It's the
yes.
same thing with marketing behind it that says this is going to solve all of your problems.
Mm,
And, that's the thing. Like and there are some really, really great other resources. There's a book called Quit Like a Woman that I really, really love and was one of my early reads when I first got sober. And she talks a lot about in this one, kind of like a feminist perspective on it. And she's talking about the way it's advertised and the way that it's marketed to moms and the way that it has just become so pervasive in society that it has been made for you to basically, if you start to question your alcohol intake, that you are now the problem, not the fact that this substance is a
mm,
problem, right? So I always like to do this kind of flip and switch because there's so much stigma still around alcohol consumption, and people really, really shy away from telling others, that they want to quit or cut back because of fear of judgment or shame or stigma. And it is not you. Alcohol is an addictive substance. I talk about this in the book. Anyone can become addicted to alcohol if they put it in their body enough, right?
mm,
So it really isn't about just the person over there who lives on the streets and can't keep a job. There are people who are really, really struggling. And we live in a world where it's either you drink or you go to AA and there's no in between. And over the last 3 years, it is opening up. There is more of this space for people to say, you know what? I think maybe I should cut back. And you don't have to be a daily drinker to decide that you want to quit back. You don't, or cut back. You don't have to be even a weekly drinker. All you have to do is say, I don't really like how this is affecting me. And that is enough for you to say that you want to make a change to it. So please don't feel like you have to be an alcoholic, for lack of a better word, in order to quit or to cut back. This is you taking your power back away from this substance that is unfortunately having a lot of control over our society.
it's such a good message to wrap the podcast up on. And I'm glad that you've touched on the support side of things, because I know that you've set up your own kind of support system, because
Mhm.
historically there's only been AA, which, as you said, it's there for alcoholics. And if you don't come under that label, then the support has been lacking. So perhaps you could
Mhm.
tell us a little bit about what you've set up to support people.
Yeah, so I have a online community and course and programming called Functional Sobriety. And that is really, it's a functional medicine, nutrition-based approach for a sober or sober curious lifestyle. And so we have women around the globe in our program who really come together just for support and accountability. We have weekly right now we have daily meetings, but usually several times a week we have meetings where people get on and connect and share their stories. And, we do education around kicking cravings with nutrition, about improving gut health, improving and supporting hormone balance in that post-alcohol world. And it's really a great place for people who are just wanting to kind of dive deeper into this, but get a little bit more support specifically in this avenue. And I really love it because there are some other programs out there that are focused on helping people that kind of fall into this in between space, not necessarily that they're going to go to AA, for example, but our space is the only one that is wellness and nutrition focused. So it really is a unique place, especially if you're interested in kind of that nutrition forward approach and you want to look at this from a health perspective. The other thing I'll kind of close out in saying, Louise, is that I have people all the time who are afraid to share with others what they're doing. They don't want that judgment and shame, and they don't know how to tell people that they're quitting and cutting back. And I say, health is the greatest justification behind it, right? So you don't have to say you're doing it because you have a problem. You're doing this because you're focused on your health, and this is not in alignment with the health goals that you have, right? So use that as your kind of reason why you're doing this. It doesn't have to be because you identify as having a problem with it.
There's no better reason, is there, than to
Mm-hmm.
optimize your health. That's a really great
Mm-hmm.
message. Brooke, this has been such a good conversation. I think it's been such a exciting topic, and I'm sure that listeners are going to want to hear more from you and about what you do. So how can people connect with you online? How can they get hold of your book?
Yeah, so the book is available wherever books are sold. So you can check it out on Amazon, should be in your local bookstore, depending on where you are. But you can also learn more about me in the book online at functionalsobriety.com or brookescheller.com. And I'm most active social media on Instagram, and I post a lot of tips and tricks and goodies for you on there. So it's Dr. Brooke Scheller, Dr. Brooke Scheller, and head over there, and you can always send me a DM too if you have questions or want to chat more about any of this.
Awesome. Well, we'll make sure we get all those links in the show notes so that it's easy for everyone to find. But thanks again. It's been so, so good. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Louise. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I really hope you enjoyed this episode. Now, if you have a question or a topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast, then why not head to speakpipe.com/Louise Digby, where you can leave me a voice note and ask me anything that you want. Or if you'd rather, you can ping me a message on Instagram as well. If you haven't already, then make sure you hit follow, like, subscribe by going to YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. And if you've got a spare moment, I'd be so, so grateful if you would leave me a quick review and let me know how this podcast has impacted you. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.